Assalamu alaikum viewers, a very warm welcome to all of you watching Hidayat TV. I'm Haider with another episode of Generation Gap. Viewers, according to Joseph Stalin, he said that writers are the engineer of human soul. It is very unfortunate that the part of the world we live in, we are very close to Iceland, a country where every 1 in 10 is a writer or a publisher. On the other side, our language, Urdu, spoken across the world, 104 million people communicate in this language, and there are very few of us who know about the most celebrated writers in Urdu literature. One of them is Saadat Hasan Manto, born in 1912, and he lived a very short life of only 42 years, but he wrote more than 250 short stories in that 24 years career. Who was Manto? A celebrated storyteller, or someone whom we hated so much for showing us the ugly face of society? To talk about Manto and to find out how Manto is related today, we are joined by Raza Naeem, who is a research fellow at Institute of Development Studies at Lahore School of Economics. He's a writer, translator, literary critic. Charles Wallace research fellow for 2013 and 14 for the University of Bradford, and also he was here at SOAS for a conference, and he read his paper on Muslim South Asia on Manto as well. Assalamu alaikum, Raza. Thank you very much for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Tell us, who was Manto?
Well, the short answer to that question would be that he was a rebel, and with a cause, and multiple causes, and I think the experiences which he had both in pre-partition India and post-partition Pakistan prepared him for his role as one of not only as one of Urdu language's most celebrated writers of the 20th century, but also as a very acute social critic of trends of religious fundamentalism, US imperialism in both India and Pakistan, and sectarianism and religious fanaticism. And of course he was a critic of capitalism, much before such a critique became fashionable in that part of the world. So for me, he's much more than a writer or a translator. I think he's a social critic, and I think his relevance has never been felt more as at this particular time in the history of the world and of South Asia more specifically.
Okay, before we talk more about that, how he's related today, tell us about his childhood, because obviously you have researched a lot on Manto. And
well, he was born in 1912, as you said. Just 2 years ago, 1 year ago, the whole world celebrated his birth centenary, and he was born in a Kashmiri family, a respectable Kashmiri bourgeois family, and he was the only son from his father's second wife. And I have argued in one of my published pieces that perhaps this statistic had something to do with his later feeling that he was perhaps the odd one out, because his father's first wife bore him 3 sons and 7 daughters, and being the only son from his own mother, he had his elder sister with whom he was particularly close. I mean, he was never close to his father, and so his father was a very puritanical sort of a person, very devout, very religious, and and a respectable person in bourgeois society.
And he, obviously the family is a more Punjabi family in central Punjab, northern Punjab, Indian part.
Yes, a Punjabi family, but a very proudly Kashmiri family, and something which Manto's father was very proud of, and something which Manto himself was also very proud of all his life, of being a Kashmiri, because you can live in central Punjab, and Punjab of course was and still is a multitude of different castes, but if you're a Kashmiri in Punjab, then that sets you a bit apart, because Kashmiris are well known for their good taste in eating, drinking, clothing, so
Yes,
so that's the reason his family was always, and he himself was always proud.
So how
of
did his
Kashmiri
journey
stock.
begin from being a, because this is another criticism in literature, that being a Punjabi you cannot speak good Urdu. So how did his journey started from being a Punjabi Kashmiri and then going from Amritsar to Delhi and from Delhi to Bombay onwards?
Well, you would be surprised that he tried to pass the matriculation examination, and he three times he failed. And this is something which the orthodox literary critics have never forgiven, apart from their other criticism on him. He was not schooled in this language in the traditional sense of the word, in which he was to
and
dominate.
I think it's also worth mentioning that he used to fail Urdu exams as well in his school.
Yes, and obviously this, as we know, had nothing at all to do with any deficiency of faculty. It simply had to do with the fact that the surroundings with which he faced at home, and later on this actually led to his cultivating, I believe this failure at that level to attain this distinction in being able to pass an examination in Urdu, I think contributed to his cultivation later on of literary friends, literary people. I mean, of course.
And that's, I think there's another also message, that if you cannot pass the examination, that does not mean that you cannot be celebrated later as an author.
Of course, some of the world's great literary talents have never been schooled in the traditional sense of the word. I think of Oscar Wilde, for example, who was one of Manto's very personal favorites, and quite probably matched him in the sense of pleasure loving and literary taste. And of course, Manto's childhood was a happy childhood. Of course, at home he felt oppressed, but when he was out of home, he was always in the company of ruffians and riffraffs, with whom of course he drank, he gambled, he went to prostitutes, obviously never slept with them, and of course read literature. And one of his mentors, Bari Ali, was later on to play a very seminal role in his life.
In the 1930s.
Yes, he was obviously 1920s actually. He was still in India, and he was beginning to translate some of the European classics. He was beginning to read them in English and to translate them at the encouragement of Bari Ali. He read Maupassant, for example, who's one of the gods of French short story writing, and short story writing in particular. He read the Russian classics, Tolstoy and Chekhov. He read the Chinese short stories, and he had eclectic literary tastes. And of course, he read Oscar Wilde, and he translated them into Urdu. And and this was, I believe, the stepping stone of Manto's entry, coming out on his own, coming up onto his own as a would-be great writer of Urdu literature.
So let's move on to the age of 19 when he published his first. So tell us the background of that first short story he published.
Well, his first short story, this was of course the time when he was much influenced by the social realist, short story writers who were, you remember 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution had just happened in Russia, and it had a tremendous impact all over the world. In India it had a tremendous impact.
And I mentioned Stalin as well, so he was there at that time.
Yes, and and it's interesting because Manto later on wrote a very interesting essay on the Bolshevik Revolution, where he actually praised Stalin, and as the architect of this new Soviet Union, a worker state. So the Soviet Union, the establishment of the state, had a very profound impact on India also. And young Manto was growing up. He, on one hand, he was inspired by the winds coming from Bolshevik Russia. On the other hand, he was inspired by a local hero, Bhagat Singh, who has been the subject of some very good films in India. He was inspired by the struggle of Bhagat Singh for Indian freedom, who was also a socialist and a communist. So, the first short story which he wrote, I believe it was Tamasha. It was written in the aftermath of the 1919 Jallianwala Bagh massacre, which is still inscribed on the historical memory.
And there is
of
a very
the
rebellious tone in that.
Yes, and I mean, the protagonist is a little boy, of course, not unlike Manto, who is very curious of what is going on in the street, of bombs being dropped and a lot of protests being held. And of course, the father has a very tough time in that story, trying to, and he just makes up a story at the end. So that whole collection of short stories actually was inspired. It was called Manto Ki Afsane, or the
Atishparas.
Sorry, Atishpare. Yes, the Nuggets of Fire.
Yes.
That whole short story collection is inspired by the social realist mode of storytelling. It has also other short stories. For example, the one which I personally think is very powerful is called Inqilab Pasand, or the Revolution Lover, where it is actually quite autobiographical, because it talks about someone who questions society, and society rejects him as an outcast because of the questions he's asking are troubling for the people. Why is there poverty? Why are there societies divided into rich people and poor people? And if you like, I can read out an extract, please, which I have myself translated. It's very powerful. So this is, I think, the most powerful story of this collection, called Lover of Revolution, and it chronicles the transformation of a carefree young man like Manto into a thoughtful person who's vexed at the plight of the downtrodden. And I quote, "They call me a madman, they whose pulse of life is dependent on the blood of others, they whose paradise has been built by bricks borrowed from the hell of the poor, every note of whose instrument of ostentatiousness is covered with the sighs of widows, the nakedness of orphans, and the mournful wails of heirless children. Let them call me that, but a time is coming when these very people, shrouded in poverty, will write their curses dipped in the collective blood of their hearts upon the foreheads of these people. That time is near when the doors of earthly paradise will open for every man. I ask, if I am in comfort, then why should you live a life of misery? Is this humanity then, that I, being the owner of a factory, watch the dance of a new courtesan every evening, every day waste thousands of rupees in gambling, and spend money ceaselessly on my weakest desires, and my workers can't even afford one square meal, their children pine for an earthen toy? Then the fun is that I am civilized, am respected everywhere, and those whose sweat prepares my pearls are seen with contempt in the social circle. I hate them myself. You tell me, aren't both these oppressors and oppressed unaware of their responsibilities? I want to make both of them aware of their responsibilities, but how to do it? I don't know." End quote.
So wonderful, so powerful.
Yes, and in Urdu it's
paradise of rich built by the bricks.
And I have to have a disclaimer that in Urdu it is even more poetic, and the impact is just electrifying. So this story and the collection basically embodies the hope which Manto saw for India, as some, inspired by the Bolshevik Revolution and the struggles of Bhagat Singh, and obviously Subhash Chandra Bose and so many others, that there would be a country where there would be the less oppression, and the class divide between the rich and the poor would one day be obliterated, and so this story basically, and this phase of Manto's life in India basically encompasses
and
that.
How wonderful it is that he was only 19 at that age. How thought-provoking that it would be.
Yes, and there were other young men and women like Manto who,
yes, I'll come to that now. The progressive movement
actually joined political parties. I mean, there was Bhagat Singh, of course. He was also he was part of the socialist movement. I mean, he was executed by the British at age 21. So he has been a perennial revolutionary. Like Che Guevara. So there were other capable young and women like Manto, but I think Manto saw his vision in literature. I mean, that was how he saw his literary calling. I mean, he was really very political, as his later stories and essays, if turn out to be. But he obviously did not join any political organization, but he thought that his future and the way he could affect the thought of the masses was through literature.
Do you think he was I mean, at the later stage of his life, he was living in a very utopian society, and he was obviously relating and writing and taking the characters from the very low part of the society, but whatever his dreams or aspirations were, is it more utopian? We all know that is not possible.
Well, I think I mean, Manto's characters, you just said that they were taken from the very dregs of society. The rejected, the outcast, pimps, prostitutes, peddlers, revolutionaries, street children, women, whom polite society had discarded. I mean, he based all these characters not only on his own aspirations, but he actually came in contact with them. And I believe, I mean, everyone who was living in that time was, believed in utopia. I think it was Oscar Wilde who said that a life without utopia is not worth having. I mean, so I mean, everyone who was anybody, who was a thinking person in the later half of the 20th century, was inspired by that utopian, call it utopia if you like, of freedom, and and I think if you look at the history of the later part of the 20th century, I mean, the instincts were right. I mean, there were places in different parts of the world where freedom was not achieved through peaceful means, like in Algeria. It was very violent. Millions of people died to actually achieve that freedom. So I would argue that the intellectuals associated with that project of freedom and the parties were, not actually utopian.
They're very idealistic.
They yearned they yearned for a new society which was free from colonialism and free from the white man's burden, and yet also, as Frantz Fanon said, would provide the wretched of the earth with a way to deliver them from this oppression. And at that time you probably can't fault them for being utopian. Now of course we are living in a different time when even the thought of entertaining such a utopia, or even remembering what it was like, seems like a distant memory. In the age of media, and we have short attention spans now, and our memories are very, very short, unfortunately.
Okay, let's move on to 1940s, when he moves to Bombay, and well, some of the critics claim that that was the most successful part of his career, that he didn't have any problem with the money, his family was settled, he was writing films as well, so he was quite successful at that time.
Yes, he was moving constantly in for work between Bombay and Delhi, and of course he was being known as as a very famous radio script writer, as a film script writer, and he was never in want of money, but I mean, I believe that had he remained in India, most of his contemporaries agree that he would have been best remembered as a great radio dramatist, but I believe, I think well, you may want to explore that further, but I believe it was only when he migrated to Pakistan that he actually became the sort of writer of world stature, that he began. Of course, Manto being a very political person, I think his calling was different than just to be a great drama and script writer, and of course money was never a problem for Manto. It was never a problem for him in Pakistan.
And he
also
made very good friends while he was in.
Yes, some of his most memorable associations with some of the great Indian writers were made in the pre-partition days. His friendship with Ismat Chughtai herself, a very great icon of feminist and short story writing, and of course Rajinder Singh Bedi, and they were all part of the progressive writers movement. Krishan Chandar and Upinder Nath Ashk, and also some of his rivalries as well. Which actually forced him to take that
and
next step.
And he fallen out with progressive movement as
yes.
Okay,
yes,
we'll take a break now, and when we come back, we talk more about Manto and his departure from India and when he comes to Pakistan. So stay with us. Welcome back, viewers. We are talking about Saadat Hasan Manto and joined by Raza Naeem. Raza, we were talking about Saadat Hasan Manto, and I want to know more, and I want viewers to know more about when he joined progressive writers movement in 1930s. And do you think he was progressive? And how did he fall out with those progressive writers?
Well, this is a very contentious issue, and of course, Saadat Hasan Manto had he had his position on it. I mean, the Progressive Writers Association was formed in India in the 1930s, and the main objective of it was to rid Indian society of colonialism and religious obscurantism. So, it created a stir when some of the most prominent writers of India published this collection called, Angare, which basically took the, religious fundamentalism head on. Some of the best known progressive critics and writers were associated with it, like Ahmed Ali, like Sajjad Zahir, not Ismat Chughtai, Rashid Jahan, and Manto was not associated with this particular collection, but he, as I mentioned, the Bolshevik Revolution and the struggle of Bhagat Singh had a big impact on Manto, and that brought him closer with the Progressive Writers Association, and he joined the PWA, and the PWA hailed his initial two collections of short stories, which I mentioned, Atish Pare and Manto Ke Afsane, which were written in that mode of social realism. However, it was later on, after, Manto officially never took himself out of the PWA, even when he moved to Pakistan. The PWA treated him in a very step-brotherly manner, and when we'll come to the Pakistan phase later on, but in India, he started chafing at this ideological straitjacketing, which was a hallmark of the Progressive Writers Association, because they wanted all of their writers to write within the confines of a particular ideology. I mean, the ideology was progressive of course, but obviously, Manto thought that, progress does not just mean that you are glorifying a worker, or that you are glorifying a mother, like some of the great Soviet writers like Maxim Gorky did. In fact, in 1944, he made a very famous speech at Jogeshwari College in Mumbai, and that expressed his view of whether he was a progressive or not. And I will, to answer your question, I will directly quote from that speech.
Please.
It's a wonderful passage. He says, and I quote, "The greatest confusion has arisen about this progressive literature, although it needn't have. Literature is either just that, otherwise it's not. Man is just that, otherwise he's not, but a donkey, a house, a table, or something else. It is said, Saadat Hasan Manto is a progressive human. What is this nonsense? Saadat Hasan Manto is human, and every human should be progressive. By calling me progressive, people don't describe any quality of mine, but prove their crudeness, which means that they themselves are not progressive. That is, they themselves don't want progress. I desire progress in all fields of life. I want that you all should progress. A woman who works in the mill all day and goes to bed at peace in the night cannot be my story's heroine. My heroine could be a cheap prostitute who is awake all night and while sleeping in the day sometimes sits up after having a nightmare that old age has come knocking at her door. How could I bear a culture, civilization and society that is already naked? I don't even try to clothe it because that's not my job, but of the tailors. People call me black penned, but I don't write on the blackboard with black chalk. I use white chalk so that the blackness of the board becomes even more evident. End quote. So, this is frequently cited as his declaration of war with the PWA, but
I think it's quite it's very ironic as well. The Progressive Writers Association at the moment itself is doing what Monto didn't want to do in his lifetime as well, that divide people. So progressive writing movements wants writers to write in a certain parameters, which is never Monto's theme or his frame of mind, because he wanted to target everyone, and as you mentioned, quoted from is that he wanted to write on the blackboard with a white chalk, so all the evil and ugliness of the society comes.
Yes, I mean that is the irony, because the PWA unfortunately did not analyze Indian society on its own merits. It took its orders from Moscow, and obviously Moscow is a different country. I mean, what writers analyze there has got little or no bearing. I mean, you can admire the style of the writers, you can even imitate them, but to really import that whole model into Indian society, which was not even free of colonialism at that point in time, I think was a bit asking too much. And of course, 50, 60 years on, who remembers the PWA? Everyone remembers Saadat Hasan Manto, and this irony became even more clear when they moved to Pakistan and what happened there. But obviously that's the subject of another conversation. But yes, the irony was not lost on Manto, that unfortunately, Manto never took himself out of the PWA. The PWA expelled Manto, but that was when they moved to Pakistan. At this stage of his life in India, in pre-independence India, he is still pretty much part of the PWA, but he is beginning to chafe under these restrictions and this ideological straitjacketing which is being placed on him and all other writers who are trying to really talk about progress and civilization in the context of
so we are talking about a moment, or at a moment that 1930s, 1940s, there is no other mode of communication, no electronic media. Writers were basically steering this whole independence movement at that time, and then especially when they are, as you said, that they have a different agenda to be, well, if you want to say it, that implement the Moscow agenda on already. So it would be very difficult for a person like Saadat Hasan Manto himself, that he wants to set free and write something which he thinks is relevant, and obviously.
Yes, I mean, and obviously he was not the only enemy, they were not the only enemy which Manto made. I mean, in the last years of his life, Manto used to joke that, with irony, that the Pakistani government regards him as a communist and the communists regard him as a reactionary. So the irony was pretty well set even when he was in India, because unfortunately and he was of course not the only writer whom the progressive writers PWA disowned. I mean, Kuratullah and Haider was another writer, and of course we can talk about Kuratullah and Haider, but obviously she's a different writer to Manto. Even I disagree with that, but he was not the only writer who the PWA disowned, to be fair to the PWA. But I think in the larger scheme of things, it was a very childish thing, and I think this straitjacketing did not serve the PWA very well, whether in India or in post-colonial Pakistan or India, and as I said before, everyone talks about Manto now, whereas the PWA, the first short story collection which they launched, Angare, is only now being translated. After 80 or 90 years after they made a stir with Angare. So I think it's time that they, I mean there are small clubs of PWA in both
Mhm.
India and Pakistan, but it's time that they probably should make amends, or maybe apologize or set the historical record straight. Not that it would really do anything to Manto's legacy,
Mhm.
but it would be nice.
So talking about Manto's timeline in India, from Tamasha in 1930s, and then there was a time when even Bhagat Singh wanted to stage the Veera, which he translated.
Veera, yeah.
Yes, he wanted to translate it. Then how tell us about the journey of Manto, that being a rebellious writer, moving towards more of the social evils and talking about the people within the society, and exposing those characters which we relate to but we don't want to, and I mean obviously due to our own for whatever reasons we don't want to highlight those characters.
Well, I said at the beginning of the program that he was always a rebel, so I don't accept that the fact that he was not accepting ideological straitjacketing of the PW made him any less of a rebel. I think he was a rebel all his life, and the proof of that lies in the fact that most of his characters, whether he was inspired by social realism or even afterwards, they were rebels in their own right, because they were outcasts of society, and they had shred of humanity in them, and what's wonderful with Manto is whether he's talking about a prostitute or he's talking about even a religious fundamentalist or a Maulana or a mullah or even a pimp or even a freedom fighter, he's refusing to take sides. He always brings out the humanity in them, and it is humanity even when he is committing bestiality, even when he or she is helping some person from another religion amidst terrible vengeance and destruction and violence, he still has an ounce of humanity left in him. So whether he's raping or he's have bestiality or sexually abusing, or even some of the vilest acts in his stories always have a positive spin to them, because he identifies with what is good, and with good even in the baddest of characters, so this is also a rebellion of sorts, because it makes us see something which, as you said, we are not prepared to see. Polite society has rejected all these as outcasts, whether it's the prostitutes or it's the pimps. I mean, if you talk about popular culture, look at how they are depicted, but Manto was one of the people, and it's interesting because when Manto died, his funeral was mostly attended by people from that class, I mean, they all cried and mourned because they had lost their champion, I mean, the pimps, the crazies, the mentally imbalanced,
so there was no one from the
outcasts.
affluent society?
Well, of course not. I mean, Manto obviously had an abhorrence of money and the culture of money, and he was obviously a critic of capitalism also, as I said, much before the critique of capitalism became fashionable. So yes, his passing away was mourned by the people, the rich people whom basically he had castigated in his writings as being the root cause of the evil.
Also, he was obviously trialed while in India. There was 3 different investigations launched on him for his writings. Obviously, altogether there were 6, but 3 in India and then 3 in Pakistan after independence. So tell us about those 3 cases which he has to face, and how did he challenge? How did he manage to get away with it, I would say?
Well, I have something for you. He, as you mentioned, in the he was basically before in pre-partition India, he was tried 3 times for his 3 short stories in Urdu called Khol Do, Open It, Cold Meat, Thanda Gosht, and Above, Below, and In Between, Upar, Niche, Darmiyan. This was before the partition, and basically in these stories he has basically not only tried to show the violence which is inflicted against women, but also sexual politics, how
how women are exploited, and
and the politics of sexuality.
I mean, that's my question. Why it is so difficult for the society, even in that time that they were unable to accept this? Was he living ahead of his time at that time, being a writer?
Well, of course, at the sound of sounding blasphemous, I have called him a prophet, you know, I mean, because he could clearly, he was a seer, he could foresee, you know, all these trends. And of course, it's interesting now in Pakistan and maybe also in India, all sorts of vulgarity can be shown on television, you know, in the crudest and cheapest of fashions, you know, and there is no comment. But you know, when Manto wrote about these things, he was branded as a vulgar, as a pervert, as a prude. So, and even now, you may be interested to know, Manto's plays are not allowed to be screened on television. That is, yeah, that is a very stark irony. In fact, in Lahore, I was once you know, doing a talk on Manto and reading some of his pieces, you know, at FC College, which is one of the more respectable seats of learning. And one young woman who was, I think, part of the faculty got up after the talk and said, well, I still can't read Manto in my home, you know. And she sounded like someone from a privileged class. So you see, these are the internal contradictions which Manto hated, you know. I mean, these contradictions that, you know, that we hate, you know, humanity is a bundle of contradictions, you know. I mean, it can see other people indulge in that, but when the finger is pointed to one's own failings, you know, one just shies away from them. So this is a hypocrisy. So Manto was not a hypocrite, and because he pointed the mirror at humanity, his critics never forgave him, and they still don't forgive him. So yes, in that respect, you know, he was a seer, he was a prophet. He predicted this even before the age of television and the age of reality television shows, where each and every vulgarity and bestiality is now justified in the name of ratings. You know, Manto couldn't care less about. He spoke truth to power. You know, I mean, at a time when it was increasingly risky, and as Manto's own life shows, you know, he was tried 3 times, barely survived going to jail before partition, and 3 times after partition. So this makes him a very unique figure. You know, no other subcontinental figure or even a rebellious literary figure has ever, you know, been so on the wrong side of the censors as Saadat Hasan Manto.
So he has been on the wrong side for the people, for the mainly the affluent class.
Yeah, and I think he would have prided himself.
So do you think society will we ever be able to accept Saadat Hasan Manto as Manto?
Well, luckily that is not for the moral and religious custodians to decide. You know, I think the Manto is getting increasingly popular, as you know, even the birth centenary showed he was celebrated not just in the Urdu speaking world, but he was celebrated across the world. His popularity is now increasing. You know, there are some socially conscientious theatre groups in Pakistan and India who are now regularly staging his short stories, regularly organizing readings. You know, even there are plays being made on his life, you know, which are introducing Manto to a new audience, you know. And people like myself, in a very, very humble way, we are trying our best, you know. I mean, I'm not very old myself, so we are also trying our best to popularize Manto, but not in the way these reality TV shows will popularize, but in the way which really connects him to the society of which he was
masses, and
part,
obviously we can relate
and
to.
Obviously he was a rebel in the tradition of the Sufi saints, you know, like Mansoor or, you know, Bulle Shah, who basically stood up for truth all their lives, paid with their life and with you know, were rejected and outcast. But as the time goes by, the people who detracted them have paled into insignificance, and while they themselves have grown in stature. So I think Manto is definitely one of those people, and I can only see his popularity increasing. And by the way, this has not got to do only with the fact that he is being translated more. I think even you know, the fact that, you know, I know people who have learned Urdu just to be able to read Manto and translate him,
and,
you know.
Atish Tasir is one of those.
Well, yes, I mean, of course,
writer.
he's one of the people, and you know, but he's not the only one.
Yes,
so I believe his, let's say, by the time we celebrate his 200th bicentenary in 3012, I think he will probably be among his, you know, among one of the world's most translated
and
writers.
I think he is again, he is, if you talk about him on a larger scale, that in Urdu literature he is one of the most obviously contentious and controversial writer, but a very mostly celebrated writer as well. He's been translated in so many languages. There are so many, at least 15 countries, I believe, and their doctorate announced on him. But is it unfortunate that Manto, when he died or when he passed away, obviously we'll talk more about in the second part, that he was not recognized in the society?
Well, I mean, I think Manto saw that coming. I mean, he couldn't care less. You know, he was a battler, a fighter, a rebel all his life, and you know, he was not the only rebel whom we discarded in India or Pakistan. You know, there were so many other people in Pakistan. If you're talking about specifically Pakistan, you know, we have disowned even our physics Nobel laureate Dr. Abdul Salam. You know, we hardly, you know, I mean,
and I think it's the same goes for Malala Yousafzai, and even historically we don't own Bhagat Singh as well, who was born in this side of the border,
whose anniversary is celebrated, death anniversary, his date of execution, which is ironically 23rd March, you know, which has a very big place in Pakistani nationalist historiography. You know, some liberals and leftists do line up in Lahore where he was executed from India and Pakistan to celebrate, you know. But I think Manto basically saw it coming when he remarked that, you know, after I am gone, even if the government of Pakistan decides to give me a medal, it will be of no use to
which
me.
They gave eventually
and ironically, he foresaw that, and you know, they gave him a medal, but and now they're trying to pull his house down, which is itself a historic landmark in Lakshmi Chowk of Lahore. But you know, I mean, I don't think people like Manto need medals. I mean, they only succeed in mummifying them and making them inaccessible. You know, just look at the way we have done to Muhammad Iqbal, who has the misfortune of being the national poet of Pakistan. I think more people stop reading Iqbal because he was the national poet of Pakistan, rather if he hadn't been the national poet of Pakistan, you know. But look at how Muhammad Iqbal's teachings have been mummified, and you know, and which Iqbal are we teaching? So similarly, like Manto, you know, I mean, I always lament this, that Manto basically, I mean, the worst punishment you can give to someone is to banish them from memory. Not only have we done it with Manto very successfully, but you know, if you look at the standard treatments of Manto, he is either treated as a realist of sex or as a realist of partition. Even there is a recent attempt by Manto, by a very well-known literary critic, to prove that he was actually a Pakistani, a patriotic Pakistani, which I think is beyond question. You know, it is beyond question.
I think it's a debate less as well, when he spent only 7 years.
And in India, whereas they are saying, why did Manto migrate to Pakistan? So you can see the petty questions which are still haunting people about Manto 50 years after it became very conscious. Why Manto migrated to Pakistan, why he was a patriotic Pakistani, maybe not a very religious Pakistani. So you see, so Manto, I think he couldn't care less about what people, I think.
So he was more of a humanist who would care about people above this class, creed and culture.
Yes, he was, as I said, he was a humanist in the tradition of best traditions of the Sufis, you know. I mean, and he was a man of God, you know, and and he was lucky that there was no fatwa in his lifetime. And you know, one reason probably was that, you know, the gravestone, you know, the gravestone which he chose for himself was a very blasphemous gravestone.
Yes, indeed.
So his sister very wisely replaced that gravestone with a verse from Ghalib, you know, otherwise maybe the grave would have been desecrated. So he was very lucky. I am sure if Manto was alive, he would have been tortured. He would, you know, he was very lucky to have died also without a fatwa to his head.
Within the first 7 years of post-independence. Thank you very much, Raza. We will be joined by Raza again in the next episode. We will talk more about Manto, his journey in 1948 to Lahore until his death in 1955, and obviously we will talk about the legacy of Manto and how we can relate, how our younger generation should read, and why it is important for us in our events, in our day-to-day life, how Manto can be relevant to us. Till then, with this dua, as always, kam humko na de siwaye gam shabbir, shabbir ka gam baant raha hai to idhar de. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad.